Login accepted.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to CCDC's Week 6 meeting. This is the last meeting in the summer boot camp, so thank you all for being here. Today I'm going to be talking about common services, and I made an announcement on the Discord a little while ago, but if you didn't see it, that's okay. There's going to be a lab at the end of this meeting, so if you can go on Camino and clone the CCDC services pod, that would be great. All right, so let's get started. So, who am I? My name is Sarah Downing. I'm a second year CS major here at CPP, and I was an alternate member on the CCDC team last year. Um, and yeah, you might remember me. I spoke a little bit during the Linux week. So, this is our weekly schedule. This is the last summer bootcamp meeting. So, congrats for making it this far, and thank you everyone for being here. Um, just as a reminder, if you are interested, CPTC tryouts are next weekend, and then following that, we'll be doing the CCDC Fall Bootcamp from August 30th to September 13th. I believe that's 3 weeks of meetings, and our tryouts for CCDC will be September 20th and the 21st from 1 to 5 p.m. And yeah, more information will be to come on tryouts. So uh, stay updated on the Discord and keep coming to the meetings if you're interested. We would love to have you guys all try out because we have a lot of spots open on our team, and yeah, it's also just great practice. Um, yeah, okay. I think that's all I have to cover there. So today we're gonna be talking about services. That's pretty much it. Services are a really big part of CCDC, so it's kind of important to know. And we talk about services a lot, but we want to clarify the terminology because there's kind of multiple things that we mean when we say a service. So hopefully you'll leave this meeting with somewhat of an understanding of how to identify, install, troubleshoot, and configure services, and how to identify what services are running on what ports, and also what services are most relevant to CCDC. Yeah. So first, what is a service? So there's kind of two different categories of services or two different definitions that we classify. So the first one would be your host services, which are just normal services running in the background of your computer. It's just a background process running on your computer. So it's a pretty broad definition. But the second definition would be business services, which are specific services that serve some kind of functionality for the business that's relevant towards the business. So, for example, that could be like a client-facing website that customers are interacting with, or maybe that's just an internal website that like the business employees use. And yeah, so business services, I think one way to think of them is that they exist to serve a purpose for the business, where host services are just background processes, and that's not one-to-one. So what I mean by that is that multiple host services can make up a business service, like, or you could have like a web server that's dependent on a database, and the web server and database would both be considered host services, but those together would be a business service because it has some functionality to the business. Um, yeah, and so let me see if there's anything else. Also SLAs. So for business services, in real life and in CCDC, it's a little different, but same idea. There's an obligation to uphold uptime on your services. So what that means is that for example, your website needs to be up and running because your customers need to be interacting with that. If they're not, they're going to be angry if it's down. Um, so in real life, this could come if your service is down for too long, that could possibly come with like legal penalties or fines if your um, service is down for too long. But in CCDC, this typically means that instead of, first of all, when your service is down, you're not going to be making any points off of it. But if it's down for too long, you will also start losing points. So it's very bad. So it's very important to keep your important business services up. And yeah. We're going to talk more about services throughout this whole presentation. So if you guys have any questions, make sure to let me know in the chat. But so here's an example of host services on Windows. It says at the bottom, you can type Windows key plus R and then type in services.msc and this is what it will bring you to. We'll show you all the host services that are running on your machine. And so here's a good example of a host service that may not necessarily be a business service is Microsoft Defender antivirus. So an antivirus is typically not serving a business role for your customers or employees. It's just a service that's running on the background of your computer, scanning for malware. So compared to a web server or, maybe some type of remote access protocol that's serving your customers, antivirus is just defending your computer from malware. It's not necessarily important or relevant to the business. So that would be an example of a host service. And here's some more examples of what host services look like on Linux. So you can see if you're running a system that has systemd, which should hopefully be most systems that you'll deal with, you can use systemctl to see what stuff is running, which is the first part of this screenshot. And it gives you a lot of information. You can see, like, for example, in this screenshot, cron and Docker are running, which are probably, Docker could be, but they're probably not business services. Those are more host services that are just running in the background on your machine. And if your system doesn't have systemd, or if you type systemctl and that command isn't recognized, you could also use service, which I believe is an older command. It doesn't show you as much information, but it'll still list all the processes and services that are running on your machine. Yeah. So, yeah, as I said earlier, business services aren't always necessarily one host service. They can be a combination of multiple. So this is kind of a diagram of what, business services would look like and how they're interacted with. So it kind of gets confusing because there's a client and a customer. So we'll say the customer is like the person trying to interact with the business. The customer would be like this green box in the picture, and the customer uses some kind of client to interact and communicate with the business service. And the business service can have one or multiple dependencies so for example, your business service might be a web server, as I said earlier, and the dependencies could be databases that it's dependent on. And I actually have another example coming up. So this is an example of a business service, Roblox. It could be considered a business service, or it's a helpful example to kind of fit it to that picture on the last slide, and see what I mean by all this terminology. So basically, your customers would be the player trying to look for play games, and the service that they're accessing would be the Roblox website and its contents, all the games on here. So let's see it kind of more fit to the diagram. So the customer is just the Roblox player, and they access the Roblox web server through their web browser. And then the Roblox web server likely has some dependencies, some databases that it is dependent on and using, but obviously I don't exactly know how Roblox runs. This is just a hypothetical diagram to show you guys an example of how you could fit a business service to this diagram and what that would look like. So what does this mean for CCDC? Why does this matter for CCDC? A lot of the times there will be a lot of host services running on your machines, and you'll need to figure out which ones are business services and relevant to the business and how they're connected or what they're dependent on. Because when you're dropped into CCDC, you might not know all these services that are running on your machine until you start inventorying them. And you're being scored, 40% of your score is on services. So you kind of need to know and figure out which services are where and what they're dependent on, stuff like that. So how can you secure a service? That'll be the next part of this presentation. So this is sort of a process that could be helpful for securing services. Threat modeling, it's kind of the process of figuring out what threats exist and that could attack a service. So, for example, you would start with functionality, which is you have to first figure out what the service is actually doing, what its function is, to figure out how it could be attacked and how you could mitigate that. So first, you want to ask yourself, how does the service function? How does it work from a technical standpoint? Because these questions can kind of give you insight or start thinking about how could an attacker take advantage of how it works from a technical standpoint, and use that for bad. So, for example, what ports is it running on, dependent services, all questions that you want to ask yourself when you're thinking about the functionality of a service. And um, then you can kind of start thinking about the attacks and identify the attacks that an attacker could do. So, for example, if you're hosting a website that customers are interacting with, an attacker could perform some sort of denial of service attack, or they could change, delete the contents of your website, deface it, which could, if your customers are trying to access some type of portal or some type of service on your web server, if an attacker takes that all down and just makes your website blank or changes information on your website, that could, potentially lead to you losing points. And so then once you've thought about the attacks that an attacker could do, the next thing would be to figure out the mitigations. How can you secure the service and prevent this from happening? This is the last thing you should think about once you've identified how it works and what ways it could be attacked. So kind of some places to start are there configurations you can do or a patch you can download that affects the attack's requirements that would, mitigate the attack and not affect the functionality? Because you need to keep the functionality. That's kind of number one, and also, stop an attacker. And another thing you want to think about when you're thinking about ways to mitigate an attack is how quickly and how easily a mitigation can be put in place, because oftentimes there's kind of best practices in real life, and then there's also like you're in CCDC and you're on a time crunch, and you kind of just need to do what works immediately to keep an attacker out, keep red team out. Um, but some other things you could think about are, can you cut an attacker's access through host level or network level firewall rules? And yeah, overall, you just want to find the quickest and easiest, but also effective solution. So this kind of way of modeling and looking at a service can help you walk you through figuring out what a service is and how it can be attacked and what are the ways you can mitigate those attacks. So this is kind of what I was touching on earlier. Is the juice worth the squeeze? So in CCDC, oftentimes we're kind of under a lot of time pressure, and you want to make sure you have the most impact when configuring a service. All right. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Can you guys hear me now? Back? Okay, perfect. Okay. I don't know, the microphone might have died or something. It was having issues, but sorry about that. So, um, anyways, so yeah, basically what I was saying was that in CCDC, you're often very limited on time, and you have to do what you have to do to keep it red team out, keep an attacker out. So for example, if you had a database on one of your machines, let's say the competition just started and you really don't know what's on this database, what depends on it, things like that. Your realistic option in real life, the best practice would be to audit the database, apply principle of least privilege, and make backups, all these different security methods. But in CCDC, sometimes you just are really limited on time and you have to get red team out as quick as possible or block them from potentially having access. So, for example, in CCDC, maybe your option is just trying to do some firewall rules to keep them out if you can, because a database, if a web server is just dependent on the database, then really realistically, most times I would say that only the web server really needs access to it. Like your customers are not going to need access to the database specifically, so it might make it easier to block red team out, knowing that outside traffic, external traffic shouldn't need to be hitting the database directly. But yeah, so overall, in real life, you should definitely follow best practices and, everything like that. But in CCDC, sometimes it's more important to just quickly mitigate a security issue, and then later on, if there's time, secure it better. Um, yeah. So now we're going to be talking about what services exist, and just kind of overview of services that are common in CCDC and that you'll definitely run into. So there's kind of like you could classify them into two groups. There's more traditional services that are kind of more simple. My understanding is they're like older and they stand alone. So for example, remote access, you probably have already had a little bit of introduction to that. Um, that's um, SSH or RDP, and basically, it's more of a standalone service versus kind of this other stuff, which is not as dealt with as much in CCDC. I mean, besides cloud, we deal with cloud sometimes, but software as a service, platform as a service, those are kind of like newer definitions of services. And so in CCDC and for this lab and in general, well, not in general, but for CCDC and for this lab, the traditional services are ones that we focus on a lot more. And I guess the other stuff kind of listed at the bottom, my understanding is that they typically use traditional services kind of in like kind of how a business service could be, a web server that has a database that it's dependent on. My understanding is that these other services could use multiple of the traditional ones like in the connected way to provide like a more abstract functionality. Okay. So in CCDC, I believe we touched on this a little bit before, but services are 40% of your scoring, which is not even half of your points, but they're definitely I feel like they're definitely something that people focus on a lot because if your service is down for enough checks, you're going to start losing points. Not only are you not making points off of that service being up, you're going to start losing points due to SLAs. So it's definitely important that if your service is down, unless it's just like a blip and it comes right up, that you start figuring out why is it down? How can we get this back up quickly? Yes.
Isn't there an escalation on the deduction with an SLA if it stays down?
I believe so. I'm not sure exactly like how many points they take off, like
I think it
or if it
depends
escalates.
on the ground changes,
Yeah.
right? If it's like some levels, I think is bigger, more points.
Mhm. Yeah. So the question was, is there an escalation of how many points you're losing if your service is down for longer? And I think our consensus is that it's possible and kind of just depends on that competition. Does that sound right, guys? I think that's my understanding too. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, it's you're definitely gonna be losing points if your service is down for too long, and that's kind of something that's dangerous because that could get you in negative points if you don't address that. But yeah, so in CCDC, you'll typically have to deal with like 10 to 30 services during the competition throughout spread out on the different VMs that you get, the different machines. And so some of the relevant services are listed on a slide, and the ones in bold we're going to cover more in depth today. So web servers and applications, file shares, remote access, and databases. But these are all pretty important and relevant to CCDC, and also just in real life, like if you're in the cybersecurity field, you'll definitely come across most of these or all of them, if not most. So, we're going to be doing a lab today. I said this earlier, but if you have not yet cloned the pod on Camino, the CCDC services one, then you can do so now. And yeah, so there's going to be a few like I guess mini labs that we're going to do today. And basically the goal of this is that you guys can get a little bit familiar with the functionality and have some examples like using different services and also get like hands-on work with installing and configuring some services. And yeah, we're gonna go over for each of the services that were in bold on the last slide. I'm gonna go over like what they do, and we're gonna practice installing, configuring them. So, first is remote access, which is anything that gives you access to a machine remotely, which is kind of in the name, but that's good. It's easy to remember. So there's different protocols that run on different ports for remote access. The most common, I would say, are SSH and RDP. They run on TCP, and SSH is on port 22, RDP is on port 3389, and then VNC runs on port 5900 and like 5901, 5902, I believe. It kind of continues on depending on how it's configured. And WinRM is on port 5985 or 5986. So yeah, but main idea, remote access allows you to remotely access a machine. So for the remote access lab, I want you guys to try to install OpenSSH server and X3RDP on Debian, which will allow SSH and RDP. And on Windows, I want you to set up allow remote desktop access. And then you're going to, so in your pod, there should be a Windows and a Windows Server 2019, I believe, and a Debian machine. And then you're going to SSH into the Debian from Windows and RDP into Windows from Debian. And lastly, try to figure out how to check the status of the service, make sure that it's running, and yeah, then check it if you figure that out. So let's see, it's about 1:30. I think I'll give you guys around like 20 minutes, or I'll check in a little bit and see how people are doing. If you guys have questions, please put them in the chat. And once I give you guys a little bit time to start this, I'm going to go over how to do it. So don't worry if you're stuck. We're gonna have a solution shown and I'll walk through it. But yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. Do you have a
Can you
question?
put the link on that slide?
Oh, yes, I can. I can, yes. Let me do that actually on my laptop. Yeah, that was linked there just as a guide. Generally, like if you don't know how to do something like install remote desktop protocol on Windows, like generally searching on Google, you'll be able to find guides for a lot of this stuff. So don't be afraid to do that because that's how you're gonna learn. And so this was just an example of like a guide that could come up if you were to search that. But yeah, I just put that in the chat. So you guys can refer to that. But yeah, let me know if there's any issues with Proxmox or Camino. I hope not. Yeah. Okay, sorry about the technical issues. Hopefully this should work. But I just started sharing from my other device, so hopefully you guys can see it. And yeah, so this is kind of my demo for this lab. So first I started by installing SSH on the Debian machine. So yeah. So sudo app install OpenSSH server, and then for the stuff you can just say yes to any time. It's like, do you want to continue? I believe you could also use like tac y to like automatically say yes to everything. But then I moved to the Windows server just while that's installing on the Debian machine. And you can enable remote desktop protocol, RDP, by going to local server in the server manager, which should already open when your Windows server turns on, but if not, you can just search for server manager. And there should be a spot where it says disabled. You can enable that just through the GUI, allow remote connections to this computer. And then I went back to the Debian to install the X3RDP. If you did a little bit of Googling and research, which is often you're gonna have to in CCDC, or if you're preparing for boot camps or doing your homework, you need to install its free RDP2-X11, and then you can use RDP on the Linux machine. But anyways, so back on the Windows while that's installing, I SSH'd into the Debian machine through the command line. Oh, I checked the IP address, just IPA, and then you should be able to authenticate with the same creds that you signed into the Debian machine with just through Proxmox, which is user Umbra. And yeah, so then you can see there that I successfully SSH'd in, and you can run commands and everything through the command line. So I was just demonstrating that a little bit. And yeah, so then back on here, I'm now going to show how to RDP into Windows from the Debian machine. So using FreeRDP, which is just a service. I believe there's other RDP services that you can download on Linux, but that one's popular. You need the machine's IP and the username and password. So again, you can use the administrator CCDC 2025 exclamation point creds. And yeah, this should work. Yeah. Okay. So then you can see that if you're successfully authenticated in, then you basically have like a little mini, like almost a virtual machine inside your virtual machine, where your remote accessing into the Windows machine. And yeah, and then, I went back onto the Windows machine to show how to check that remote desktop is enabled. So other than in the local server, it should say enabled instead of disabled on remote desktop after you change that setting. But you can also open up the services. You can search services, or earlier in the slides, you can press like Windows key and R and then services.msc. It should bring you to the same place, and you want to look for remote desktop services, and you can see it's running, so it should be good. You can also stop and restart the service from the GUI there. And then back on the Linux, I checked that SSH was running and that FreeRDP was installed. So you can see systemctl. So you can also use systemctl to restart services, I believe, like enable, disable. And yeah, so that's just to double check the status and that you've installed it correctly. So if you guys have any questions about that, feel free to ask. But for now, I'm gonna go back onto the computer that's in this room, because I don't know why that one wasn't able to see my videos. But anyways, um, okay. Okay, awesome. So now we're gonna move on to file shares, which, hold on, okay, yeah. Now we're gonna move on to file shares, which, like remote access, the name pretty much gives it away. You can share files. But anyways, you can use FTP is what we're gonna be installing, but there's also like Samba, which I don't know as much about, but FTP runs on port 21 and 20, I believe, and Samba is 445. And yeah, so just like with remote access, there's these different types of protocols to share files. So now we're going to be moving on to the file share lab. So on Debian, I want you guys to install VSFTPD, which it stands for like very secure file transfer protocol, something, I think, something like that. But it's a popular service used for FTP on Linux. And then on Windows, install FTP. You can install FTP multiple ways. I believe in the demo, I did it through like the IIS, which you can kind of do through the GUI, like through the server manager. That's a little bit hint, but obviously you guys can research, because Auto CCDC is researching. You have some information, but researching and figuring out how to do stuff. And but yeah, I think you can also do FTP through XAMPP. But So if you want to try that, that might be easier. And then configure guest authentication for both the FTP servers and create files and uh, be able to access them from the other machine and check the status of the service and make sure that it's running. So yeah, you guys can do this on the same VMs that you're working on. And again, I'm probably going to give around 20-ish minutes again. So just get as much as done as you can. And if you guys have any questions, let me know. And yeah, I'll be going over it again similarly afterwards. Okay. Hi everyone. Hopefully you guys made some progress with that. Again, you might not have been able to finish, but I'm trying to keep the meeting on track because we have one more lab. But yeah, I'm going to show the demo now and kind of walk through how to set up FTP on Linux and Windows. So hopefully you guys can see my screen. First, I installed FTP on Debian, and yeah, I think as that installed, I think I went over to the other machine or not. Oh, okay. So actually, I edited the config file first. And yeah, so since we wanted guest authentication, I went down to where it says anonymous enable and changed from no to yes. To allow anonymous FTP access. And I don't know if you need to do sudo there. I might have just done that by habit, but possibly if the config file is like only be able to be edited by certain users. But anyways, then I restarted FTP just because sometimes you could have some trouble after like editing the config file. So just to make sure that it would work. And then I created a file in the srv/ftp directory because that's where the FTP root is, and that's where we'll be able to see, like that's where we'll be placed when we authenticate on the Windows. So now now I think I set up FTP on Windows. So in the server manager at the top right, you can click on manage and add roles and features, and you can scroll down. You have to select web server IIS, and I believe this is just because the FTP like GUI for all the settings is in the IIS manager. But yeah, and then selecting that lets you later on it'll have the web server role ISS and you can click on FTP. I think I said this earlier, but you can also install FTP using XAMPP, and that might be easier because this is a little bit confusing. Like, why do we have to install the web server? Because I'm trying to install FTP. But anyways, I think I waited for that to install for a second, so I went back here. My bad. Okay, so oh yeah, this I was just showing how to check the status and see that FTP is running. And yeah, let me see if I can skip ahead a little bit because I believe. Sorry, okay. Oh, and then I installed just FTP instead of VS FTPD, because that will allow me to connect to the Windows machine. But sorry, I don't know how long I waited for that to download. Things might take a little bit long to download on, especially on the Windows server. So just be patient. But oh yeah, I think I cut a little bit out. So anyways, next you can go to type in ISS and it'll bring up the ISS manager where you can edit your settings for FTP. If you go to the default website, you can add a binding for FTP for port 21. So yeah, and then there's you can edit different settings through the GUI, like authentication and authorization and stuff. So you want to make sure you enable anonymous authentication because for the purposes of this lab, that's what we want to do. That might not always be the case, just depending on how you want to set things up. I also added an authorization rule for anonymous users to read and write just to make sure that it was working. And when I was testing this, I was getting some errors about SSL. So if you are getting errors like that, then setting that to allow SSL should hopefully fix that. And then I believe I looked for the FTP root. Yeah, so there the path says inet pub www root, and when I go to the file manager in a second, you'll see that there's also a FTP root folder in inet pub. I believe it says www root because there was another binding that was like HTTP for port 80. So since we're trying to set up FTP, I changed this to FTP root, and then I think I made a file in there after that, just to confirm that we are when we connect from the other machine that we're connected and we can see the information in there. Yeah. Okay. Okay. And then so then I went to connect to the FTP server running on the W machine with its IP. And since we're doing anonymous authentication, you can type in anonymous for your user and you can just hit enter when there's a password. And it should hopefully log you in. And hold on. I think I paused here for a second, but then if it doesn't log you in, the main thing I could think of is there could be firewall rules that you might have to mess with. Maybe on the Windows server. I don't know how it was set up on the machine that we gave you guys, but that would be my first thought. But anyways, you can type in like dir or ls to list the files in the FTP root, and so you can see that the bro.txt that I put on the other machine is there. So yeah, and then now I'm gonna demonstrate connecting to it from the Debian. So yeah. So yeah, also use anonymous, and then same thing with the password. You can just hit enter, and then same thing. You should be able to see the folders or the files listed in the FTP root directory. And now I believe I was just going to show that you can also check that FTP is running using the same service manager. If you find Microsoft FTP service, it should say running, and you can stop, pause, restart from here. But that's how you can confirm that you've got it set up and running. And yeah, so let me switch back to the other machine. Sorry about that. And let's see. Okay, so that's not gonna play. Okay, so hopefully that helps a little bit if you guys are going to continue working on that. But now we're gonna move on to the last lab that we have, which is about web servers and applications. So web servers are basically just services that allow the user to access, like, or web servers, like versus a web app, a web server basically serves access to the user and it's more user facing. Whereas like the application, I think, is generally more back end stuff than the web server, but you know, they're both interconnected. And so there's different types of web servers, IIS, which was kind of touched on in the FTP stuff earlier, and then Apache, stuff like that. And then there's different types of applications such as XAMPP. And normally your websites would be running on port 80 for HTTP or 443 for HTTPS. So let's get to the lab. So on the Debian, I would like you guys to try installing Apache 2. And on the Windows, I'll put this in the chat. You should try to install XAMPP, and then just what is a web root? Just try to figure that out. You don't have to submit this anywhere, but take some time, figure that out. You can browse to the web roots once you have both of the servers set up, and then you should also be able to figure out how to check the status of the service. And theoretically, once you have both of them installed, you should be able to use like a web browser on either machine and hit the other ones using its IP. If you guys would like to try that to see if it's running and accessible. But yeah, let me put that link in the chat. And again, you can do this on the same machines. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Let me see. Okay, hi everyone. We only have about like 15 minutes left, so I'm gonna move on to the demo now, just so that we can finish up on time. Let me share my screen again. I don't know why it won't let me play the videos on that one, but it's okay. All right. So, okay. So hopefully you guys were able to get started on that. So, okay, yeah. So I started in the Windows server, and to install XAMPP, you can just search XAMPP download, XAMPP install. It should be the first one. And I just installed the first one. But yeah, they have different versions there. It's probably gonna take a while to install on your guys' VMs. I think I cut some of this video down because it takes a minute to install. But anyways, on the Debian machine, I just used sudo app install to install Apache. I also did PHP MariaDB server with it. And yeah, so that should be installing too. I'm just gonna skip ahead because that part's just installing. But yeah, so let's see. Um, yeah, still installing. I cut a little bit out in the end of the video, but anyways, here there should be a cut. And so yeah, so eventually it'll finish up installing and then or downloading and then you got to install it. So um it should open up a little like installation thingy. Yep. And for XAMPP on the Windows server, the only thing I did differently was I just unclicked the FileZilla FTP server since I just set up FTP with the like through Windows ISS. So yeah, and then but pretty much everything's gonna be default settings just for this demonstration. And yeah, more installing. Um okay, so once it finishes installing, um okay. It's this part of the lab is a lot of installing stuff. So then I just checked the status of Apache to make sure that it was running with systemctl. And yeah, it says active. And here, since that's installed, I typed in the IP of the Debian machine, and you can see that Apache 2 is installed and it works. So that's nice to see. And yeah, now I believe now I'll set up XAMPP on here. So I just skipped ahead because it was installing. But once XAMPP installs, it should open up the XAMPP control panel. If not, you can search for it. And to start up the web server, you should be able to just click start on Apache. There's kind of like a log menu at the bottom if there's any issues or like logs that it wants to tell you. But yeah, so if it works, you should see that it says stop now and the name should be green. But now I'm showing where the web root of the XAMPP web server would be. It's in C XAMPP, and then like htdocs is where like a lot of files are stored. That one has stuff for the website, I believe, but all of this is just like config and like files related to the web server in XAMPP. But yeah, so now that that's set up, um, I checked the IP of the machine again so that I can go on the Debian machine and um, see if it's accessible because it should be running. And then you can just type the IP into the browser and yeah, this should be on port 80, like you shouldn't, it's taken a while to load, but yeah, there you go. You can see that it's set up correctly, and yeah. So that's the end of the demo for this part of the lab. Again, if you guys are still working on it, that's no worries at all. You can come back to I'm hoping the videos will work on the slides on the website once we post them, but if not, you guys will have this video to look back and refer back to. But let me reshare on here because we just have a few more minutes. Oh, oh, I'm actually okay. Um, let's share. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so that was our demo, and Um, so now I have a slide on databases. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to do a lab on this part, but feel free to look into that. You're on your own. So databases, they store data. Again, is kind of in the name, but that makes it easy to remember. And they're often the back end of web applications. So often they'll like web servers will be dependent on information in databases. So if your database is down, then your web server might become kind of useless. So that's helpful to know. And there's also different types of databases that run on different ports. There's like MySQL, MariaDB, all this different stuff. SQL is typically on TCP 3306. But yeah, there's a lot of different options here. And yeah, so now since we only have a few more minutes to wrap this up, let's connect it back to CCDC. All of these services are pretty prevalent in CCDC and also in real life. And knowing how to like set them up and manage them is really good for troubleshooting, and things like that of that nature. Yeah, so now we know how to set up and manage a service. So in competitions or when you're dealing with these services, you guys can refer back to the threat modeling process that I talked about earlier, because that would be helpful to figure out the ways that that service can be attacked or targeted, and then how you can mitigate or come up with a solution to stop that and prevent that. And like I was talking about earlier, is the juice worth the squeeze? If something's going to take a long amount of time to set up and like to secure properly, when you could do something that's a little quicker and maybe not like the best practice, but it will work, then in CCDC, that's often, necessary, just so that we're not spending so much time on one part of something where then other things are neglected and other services go down. But yeah, so like I said in the beginning, the tryouts for CCDC won't be until September, I believe on September 20th and 21st. But a lot of this stuff that we talked about today will be helpful for just operating in CCDC and during the tryouts. And yeah, another thing that I haven't mentioned too much throughout the presentation, but I kind of saved it for the end so you guys remember, is inventory. Taking inventory of your network is so, so important, because in CCDC, you're basically just going to be dropped in the competition, depending on what information they give you on the briefing packet. You might not know like all these different services that you're going to have to manage. And so taking inventory of your machines, seeing what's running, like, okay, what's running on what ports on what machine, is so helpful so that you keep track of everything. And so, you know what's running where, and also finding, dependencies, databases that web servers might be dependent on, is super important. But yeah, so other than that, that basically wraps up the information I have today. There's no homework this week. We're gonna continue with our we're gonna start our fall boot camps in 2 weeks from now, I believe. But you guys can feel free to continue working on the labs, and if anyone has any questions right now, you guys can throw those in the chat. If not, you guys feel free to message us on Discord, or put it in the like CCDC questions on Discord. That would be preferable, so that your peers can help out too. But other than that, that's basically all I have. Thank you all for being here, and this is the end of our summer boot camps. So congrats for making it this far. But yeah.